Driving down today, Don called and said, if you haven't left yet, you may not want to. And I was about at Orchard and I-25 at the time. And I said, well, where I'm coming from has been dry, so, if nobody shows up, we'll have coffee and do something online and call it a day. But she showed up. I was pastoring in Chilton, Texas, while I was going to Baylor for my graduate work. And Chilton's about 20 miles south of Waco. And the county is one of the counties where they feed out more cattle than perhaps any other place in the state, which is saying a lot because the Panhandle has feedlots seemingly unlimited. But Chilton could get pretty cold and could get icy. It didn't get a whole lot of snow, but got a lot of ice. In fact, it got to 4 below zero. And there was this big, beautiful yellow rose cactus right outside of the parsonage, which was right next door to the church. And it froze that cactus and killed it. And I had never seen anything like that happen. But one Sunday, it was kind of like this, and not many folks drove in from the farms and the ranches around the community. The community had one blinking yellow light in the middle of town. And so about 3 people showed up, and one of them lived, quote unquote, in town and made it easily. And I looked at him and I said, Ed, what do we do today? Do we go ahead and have the service? And he said, well, Pastor, it's kind of like this. If a rancher goes out to feed his cattle and only one shows up, he's not going to send him away hungry. So we went ahead and had the service. Following the service, I asked him, I said, so how do you think it went? And he said, well, Lee, if you go out to feed the cattle and only one shows up, you're not going to give him the whole load. So you're going to get the whole load. Oh, man. Why are we so afraid of being vulnerable? One of the myths of Texas is full of rugged individuals. And we have some of that attitude here in Colorado. After all, we're not going to let a little measly blizzard keep us from going to church. You're here. Thank you. As I said to Don, I said, look, I drive through worse just so I can go ski in fresh powder, so I can still make it to church. Not a problem. But where did this attitude come from? Because one of the lessons I learned pastoring that small church in a community with one blinking yellow light 20 miles south of Waco was that we really were a community. And if there were floods or threat of fire, the volunteer fire department didn't ask if you were Baptist or Methodist or Catholic or Muslim or Jewish. They were just glad to have the help. If a barn fell down or was blown down because of a big storm coming through, the community went and helped. And then I realized that sometimes those of us who grow up in the city are more isolated than those who grow up in the country. COVID isolated a lot of us. couldn't get out and go anywhere. You had to wear masks if you did, which I always thought was okay because, some of us, the more we hide of our face, the more beautiful America is. Why are we afraid of needing help? Why were the disciples so I want to say pig-headed, but that would be an insult to pigs. Why were they so hard-headed about wanting to keep the children from Jesus? I've tried to understand that. And I want to give the disciples a break. They knew he was tired. They knew he had been going at teaching and being with people all day. So maybe it was out of love and concern for Jesus. But Jesus made it clear that Jesus is never too busy to bless his children. And all of us are his children. They try to keep the children, and the parent or the parents of the children who brought them away, and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. But I also want to share that part of the reason that the story is in the gospel is to make clear not only that all are welcomed at God's table, but especially the most vulnerable. Michael Joseph Brown, in True to Our Native Land, in our sanctified art materials, is quoted as saying that children in the first century Israel were not blessed as much as we bless them today. He writes, "We should dismiss ideas of childhood bliss when we read this passage. Childhood in antiquity was difficult. 50% of children died before the age of 5. They were the weakest members of society. They were fed last and received the smallest and least desirable portions of food. They were the first to suffer from famine, war, disease, and natural disasters. Many, some say more than 70%, would have lost one or more parents before reaching puberty. A minor had the same status as an enslaved person, and it was not until adulthood that they would be considered a free person." Can you think of people who needed the blessing of Jesus more than the children? In the readings, Jesus offers harsh directives to protect and care for the little ones. In Deuteronomy, the Hebrew faith lays out very quickly in this section that is referred to as the law how the communities were to care for the vulnerable in their communities. Care for the immigrant, care for the orphan, care for the widow, by leaving behind gleanings in the field. Anybody know what a gleaning is? It was kind of a tithe of the crop that was left for those who didn't have a field, didn't have access to a crop, for those in need. In addition to those named in these scriptures, who are the vulnerable people groups in our world today? And this is where you can raise your hand and speak up, and I'll repeat your answer for those online so Paul can rest. Immigrants. Who else?
People of color.
People of color, especially Hispanic or African American in the age of ICE. Who else?
Homeless people.
Homeless people. Can you imagine being out in this weather? Who else? LGBTQ plus individuals. Trans individuals. If you're a transgendered person in Kansas and you've been transgendered for years, you got a letter this week saying you no longer had a valid driver's license if it didn't reflect your gender at the time of your birth. Who are some of the other vulnerable people among us? Widows? Though old people. What's that? Prisoners. I keep having to remind myself that some people consider a person my age old. And the Nile is a river in Egypt. How about those who live alone? Have no one to care for them if they're ill or they come home from the hospital. The reality is, if we're not vulnerable today, sitting where we are, standing where I am, we may be tomorrow. And that's okay to be vulnerable. Brene Brown in Vulnerability is the Path writes, what most of us fail to understand, and what took me a decade of research to learn, is that vulnerability is also the cradle of the emotions and experiences that we crave. We want deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper or more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. Owning our vulnerability and sharing it, helping others with their vulnerability and learning from it, and recognizing that doing so is anchored in our sacred texts of the Hebrew Scriptures, Mosaic Law, and the prophets, and our Christian sacred texts, and especially the teachings of Jesus. It isn't easy. Trust and faith that others will be present when we struggle with our own vulnerabilities can be frightening. And it's frightening because what if they don't show up? What if they don't care? So we're a church. We're a beloved community. Part of what reduces my fear of folks not being available to me and my vulnerability is alleviated, that's what I want, by the fact that we are in community. That's what we offer the world beyond this structure, the world beyond our beloved community. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. It ain't easy. Being a follower of Jesus never has been, especially in chaotic and dangerous times. But I'm convinced that there's no better group of people than those of beloved community to walk with us in our vulnerabilities and through the challenges that we face. May it be so for this community of faith, and may it be so for those we love. Amen.